Folks these days fantasize about going off-grid, leaving it all behind and living alone in the wilderness, where you answer to nobody. It sounds like freedom. And for tonight's anonymous sender, a hunter and trapper living on 40 acres in remote Alaska, it was, for about 8 years. This story is called Becoming Hunted, and it's a deeply unsettling account of something that moved into this man's territory one fall. Something that he tracked, that he found, that one night came to his cabin and let itself in. If you live alone in the backcountry, keep your deadbolt locked. And whatever you do, don't follow the tracks past the creek. A buddy of mine told me about your show. He and I used to work the same fishing lodge before we went separate ways. But he's still one of 4 people who has my radio frequency. He called me about a week ago, and he told me to send my story in. But I told him I didn't really have a work story. I don't have a job in any way most people would recognize the word job. But he said to try anyway. So here I am, and I apologize in advance if this doesn't fit the mold. I realize the show is about work-related stories, and what I do is more of a situation than work. I live on 40 acres in the interior of Alaska, about 70 miles from town, by a road that is paved for roughly the first 30 of those miles, then transitions into a series of increasingly optimistic suggestions about where a vehicle might go. For 4 or 5 months of the year, the road is impassable due to snow or breakup, which is what we call the period in spring when the frozen ground turns into something with the consistency and reliability of pudding. I inherited the land from my uncle, who died in 2014. He left it to me because I was the only family member who ever visited him there, and I moved on to it full-time about 8 years back, after a stretch of life in Fairbanks that I don't particularly want to get into. I'll just say it ended, and I was glad it did. So let me explain the situation. I hunt and I trap for food. I'm able to sell some pelts, marten, lynx, beaver when I can get them, and I pick up seasonal work when it's available. Like firewood cutting for the lodge that my aforementioned friend used to work at. Even equipment maintenance for a guy who runs a fly-in hunting operation. Between the pelts and the odd jobs, I can cover my property taxes, ammunition, fuel for the generator and the truck, the short list of things I can't grow, catch, or kill on my own. I'm not fully off-grid. I have electricity from the generator, a radio, a truck that works when the road does, and nowadays Starlink, which is miraculous, honestly. But I live alone by a margin that would probably seem excessive to most people. I've been doing it long enough, though, that the alone part is not a feature of my life anymore. It's just the foundation of it. I'm telling you all of this so you understand I know where I live, and I know what lives around me. I'm very familiar with the animal tracks in my area. I can identify species by track or sight. I can tell you from a scat pile what a bear ate 3 days ago, and roughly how big it was. I've had my up-close encounters too. I've had a grizzly in my yard, a moose on my porch in fact. One time a wolverine got into my storage shed and destroyed about 40 pounds of dried fish out of what I can only assume was personal malice. None of that ever scared me. Pissed me off, yeah, but never scared me. All of that is just Tuesday when you live out here. But what I'm about to describe to you is different. And it scared me badly enough that I haven't told anyone until now this experience that happened over 14 months ago. I run a meat cache about 200 yards north of my cabin, set back in the trees at the edge of a birch stand. If you're not familiar with the setup, a cache is basically a raised platform. Mine is built on 4 posts about 10 feet off the ground, with sheet metal wrapped around the posts, so animals can't climb up. You hang or store your meat up there, and the height and the metal keep the bears out. which is the entire point. Because if you're storing game meat in bear country and you don't cache it properly, you're gonna wake up one morning to a grizzly in your yard who has decided your food is his food. And that kind of confrontation ends badly for someone, regardless of how it plays out. My cache has worked for 8 years. I've had bears investigate it, I've found tracks around the base and claw marks on the posts, but nothing has ever gotten up the platform. The metal works and the height works. The system just works, which is why I was genuinely confused when I walked out one morning in late September and I found the crossbar snapped and the platform listing sideways, about 30 pounds of moose meat scattered on the ground. My first response was annoyance, because 30 pounds of moose represents roughly 2 days of hunting and butchering work. And the damage to the cache meant at least another day of repair before I could store anything else. I thought it was a grizzly that had gotten lucky or gotten big enough to just brute force my design, which can happen. A large enough bear can reach higher and pull harder than the cache was built to withstand. I gathered what was salvageable, which wasn't a lot. Most of it had been on the ground long enough to attract smaller scavengers. After that, I began to look at the tracks around the base. This is the part where things started to bother me, and I want to be precise about it. I'm aware of how this is going to sound as it goes on, and I'd rather you trust the early details so the later ones have something to stand on. The tracks around the cache were bear-like in their general characteristics. Large, 5-toed, with claw impressions forward of the toe pads. If I'd glanced at them while walking past, I would have said black bear, maybe a young grizzly, and I would keep going. But I wasn't glancing. I was crouching over them in good light on soft ground, which is about the best tracking conditions you can ask for. And what I was seeing in those conditions did not line up. The stride length was inconsistent. An animal walking at a steady pace leaves a regular pattern. The distance between its left front and left rear print stays roughly the same from one cycle to the next, because the animal's legs are a fixed length and its gait is a fixed rhythm. These prints varied by as much as 6 inches within the same trail over flat ground. The animal was not speeding up or slowing down. There was no change in the depth or angle of the impressions that might indicate a change in pace. It was just walking, and its stride was shifting as though its legs were changing length between steps, which is a sentence I'm aware makes no sense. I'm just telling you what was on the ground. The claw impressions were strange too. Some prints showed claws fully extended and dug deep into the soil. A bear's claws register the same way when it's pushing off for speed or gripping for a climb. The next print in the sequence would show the claws barely there, just faint arcs ahead of the toe pads, retracted or reduced. Bears don't do this. A bear's claws are actually fixed. They don't retract like a cat's, and their length doesn't vary from one step to the next. And the weight distribution. It shifted within the trail in a way I've never seen in any quadruped. The front prints would be deep and heavy as though the animal was leaning forward on its forelimbs, carrying most of its mass on the front end. Then 4 or 5 steps later, the rear prints would be the deep ones, and the front ones would lighten up, like the animal had rocked its weight backward onto haunches without actually stopping or changing posture. I told myself it was an injured bear. A bear with a damaged leg or hip problem could produce an irregular stride, and pain could cause weight shifting. That was the best explanation I had, and I was motivated to accept it, because nothing else made sense. There's no way I was reading the tracks wrong, and I wasn't really prepared to think that the tracks were made by something that I didn't know. I followed the trail away from the cache because, regardless of what made it, I had to know where it was coming from and how close it was denning. If a bear is working your cache, you need to figure out if it's a transient passing through or a local that's going to come back every night, and the answer determines whether you scare it off or kill it. I'm not sentimental about bears. A bear that associates your camp with food is a bear that will eventually come through your door, and waiting for that to happen out of some kind of ecological kindness is a good way to die. The trail led north-northwest from the cache into the timber. Black spruce, mostly, with some birch mixed in along the creek drainage. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the tracks were clean and easy to follow. I moved through the trees with my 30-06 and my full attention, because whatever I was tracking was big, and I did not want to walk up on it from behind. About a mile and a half from the cache, the trail entered a small natural clearing, maybe 60 feet across, where a few birches had come down in a windstorm the previous spring and opened up the canopy. I stopped at the edge of the clearing because I could see what was in it, and I needed a minute before I got closer. It was a moose calf, probably 2 days dead, based on the bloating and the condition of the exposed tissue. It had been killed and fed on, which in itself is not unusual. Bears kill moose calves regularly in the fall, and a calf kill looks more or less like what you'd expect from a large predator. One with torn hide, accessed body cavity, scattered remains, and a general mess. I've seen dozens of bear kills over my years. They can be ugly, but they do follow a pattern that I can understand. And yet this didn't follow a pattern. If you've got a weak stomach, I'm warning you now. The calf had been opened from sternum to pelvis along a line so clean, it looked like it had been done by a knife. The 2 flaps of hide and muscle on either side of the incision had been folded back onto the ground, spread flat, like how you'd place an open book face down to hold your place. The body cavity was empty, though. The organs, all of them as far as I could tell, were placed in a neat stack on the moss beside the carcass. They almost looked like they had been separated by type or arranged in size, roughly. Stomach and rumen first, followed by intestinal mass, then liver, kidneys, lungs, and heart, running largest to smallest from the calf's head toward its tail. They were evenly spaced. They were carefully oriented, too, each organ placed with its long axis perpendicular to the line of the row. They had been put there with care, by something that had a concept of organization and the dexterity to execute it. I stood at the edge, just looking at this mess. I've butchered my game for 8 years, and I have a pretty thorough working knowledge of ungulate anatomy. And I'm telling you that what I was looking at was closer to a field dissection than a predator kill. Bears obviously don't arrange stuff like that. They're indifferent to anything but feeding. And feeding to a bear is a demolition event. They go in wherever they can get a grip, and they pull when something gives, and they eat what comes loose. They leave the rest in whatever state it lands in. But what happened to that moose calf required some degree of manual precision and a conceptual framework of sorting. No normal animal did this. And now I was thinking it had to be a person. But if that's the case, what did these tracks belong to? I made myself walk through the clearing, picking up the trail on the far side. The alternative was standing there cycling through explanations that didn't work, and that wasn't going to help me figure out what was in my territory. The tracks led north through heavier spruce, climbing slightly as the terrain rose toward a low ridge that separates my drainage from the next one over. I followed them with my rifle up and my head on a swivel, checking sightlines. I was stepping lightly, because there was something bigger than me in this area. Something that wasn't human and wasn't a bear. About a half-mile past the kill site, I stopped walking. The tracks had changed. Where there had been 4 sets of prints, 2 front, 2 rear, in the alternating pattern of a 4-legged animal, there were now 2. The front prints had disappeared. The rear prints had shifted inward, moving closer together, deepening significantly, taking on the weight that had previously been distributed across 4 limbs. The stride got longer. The gait was no longer the rolling, slightly pigeon-toed walk of a quadruped. It was now bipedal, 2 feet, alternating heel to toe in a straight line through the spruce. I crouched beside the transition point and studied it. I measured the stride with my outstretched hand, roughly 30 inches, consistent, even. I looked at the depth and the angle of the impressions. I looked at how the toe area of each print bore the most weight, with the heel registering lighter. The signature of a creature walking upright with its weight centered and balanced, not some animal rearing up on its hind legs and lurching forward off balance. I told myself a bear had stood up. Bears do this. I think we've all seen the videos. They stand on their hind legs to look over brush or to get their nose above the ground level scent layer, and sometimes they shuffle forward a few steps while upright, before dropping back down. What I had never seen before, though, was a bear maintaining a consistent bipedal stride for what I paced out to be roughly 40 yards through timber, walking between trees, navigating roots and uneven ground. The gait was so smooth and regular that the spacing between prints barely varied by an inch over the entire stretch. Whatever walked upright through those spruce trees was not shuffling. It wasn't struggling to maintain balance either. This thing was walking the way I walk, easy, fluent, with a body clearly designed for exactly that posture. After 40 yards, the tracks spread again. The front prints reappeared, the rear prints lightened, and the animal was back to 4 legs, moving north at a steady pace as though nothing had changed. I stood at the endpoint of the bipedal section, looking back along the line of tracks. I could feel something shifting in the back of my mind, some load-bearing piece of my understanding of what lives in these woods, adjusting itself under a weight that it was not ready for. I followed the trail for another quarter mile, but I lost it on a rocky shelf where a creek cuts through the ridge. The ground went to cobble and gravel and the tracks disappeared, and I spent the next 20 minutes working both banks, looking for where the trail picked up again. I couldn't find it. Whatever I was following had either gone up the creek on the rocks or had crossed and continued on ground hard enough not to make an impression, and either way I was done for the day. A bit confused, I went home. I ate some dinner and cleaned my rifle, which didn't even need cleaning, but it helps to calm me down. I went to bed, and I didn't sleep terribly well. In the morning I went back out. Whatever was in my territory was probably still there, and I needed to know what I was up against. I want to be clear about something before I keep going. I'm not a guy who sees things in the woods. Again, I've been out here for 8 years, alone, and I've never once scared myself. I don't hear voices, I don't see shapes that aren't there. I don't tell stories around fires, because 1, there's no one to tell them to, and 2, I wouldn't tell them if there were. What I've described so far is what was on the ground in front of me, in soft soil, in good light, as legible and unambiguous as print on a page. I know what I saw and how to read a track as well as anyone in this part of the state. And what I read in those tracks was something that walks on 4 legs when it wants to, and 2 legs when it wants to, but can open up a moose calf like a textbook and arrange its organs by size in some neat little line. And I didn't have a name for it. Even now, I have no idea what to call it. I just knew it was out there, somewhere past the creek, in the drainage north of my cabin. And whatever it was, it knew where my food was. The next morning I crossed the creek, where I'd lost the trail. I worked the far bank for about an hour, moving upstream and downstream in widening arcs, looking for where the tracks might pick up again. The ground over there is harder, more rock, less topsoil. Not a place where you'd find impressions or prints unless conditions are perfect. I found a partial print, though, on a muddy patch about 40 yards past the creek, heading north-northwest, consistent with the direction the trail had been going before I lost it. It was enough. so I kept moving. The country past the creek is land I know well, or I thought I did. I've hunted this area for the better part of 8 years. I was familiar with where the game trails cross, where the blueberry patches are, which south-facing slopes the moose like to bed on in the early fall when the bugs die off. Even now I could draw you a map of the major features from memory. Just in August I'd walked through this exact area picking blueberries, which is an activity that takes you over the ground slowly and thoroughly. That will help you understand what I mean when I say that the cabin I found 1.5 miles past the creek was not there 8 weeks ago. It was back in this small clearing in a stand of spruce. A great spot if you wanted to be invisible from any distance greater than about 50 yards. It was a log construction, roughly but solidly built. It had a stovepipe chimney with smoke coming out of it, a woodpile along the south-facing wall stacked neatly, at least 2 cords, a game rack beside the front door, just a crossbar between 2 posts with what looked like hides hanging from it, though from the tree line I couldn't tell what kind. The setup looked well established, like it had been there for several seasons. The logs were even weathered to a gray that takes years to develop. The woodpile had the compacted, settled look of wood that's been stacked and restacked over multiple cycles. A person glancing at this place would have guessed it was 5 or 10 years old, minimum. Like I said, I'd been standing in this clearing 8 weeks prior. I picked berries within 30 feet of where that cabin sat. There was no cabin. There was no clearing, for that matter. I stood at the edge of the clearing with my 30-06 across my chest. I looked at the cabin, and I tried to construct some scenario in which it could have been built in 8 weeks by one guy with no road access and no equipment. But I couldn't do it. That's nonsense. I'm no expert in log construction, but I've had enough experience with manual labor in the wilds to know what I was looking at represented months of work at minimum. But you know what else I saw? Those tracks, the ones I'd been following, they led right to the front door. I walked right up. That's what I was here for. Yeah, I know that probably sounds like the worst idea, even insane, after everything I just told you about the tracks, the moose calf, the bipedal stretch, and the suddenly appearing cabin. I get that, but the social mechanics of the backcountry are simple and deeply ingrained. And one of the primary rules is that you don't skulk about someone else's property with a gun. You walk up, you announce yourself, and you behave like a neighbor. You don't want to be mistaken for a threat out here, because that's how you get shot at. But also, I had to know what was making those tracks. But whatever I was thinking about those tracks, the cabin had smoke coming out of the chimney. Smoke means a person, and a person means you go say hello to them. I slung my rifle over my shoulder, and I walked across the clearing. I knocked on the door. The man who opened it was tall. I'm about 6 foot. I had to look up at him, which puts him at maybe 6'3" or 6'4". He had broad shoulders and a broad chest, and he wore a flannel shirt, green and black, with canvas work pants and boots. He was smiling before the door was all the way open. I didn't expect such a quick smile. That smile was already on his face before the door swung open, fully formed, as though he'd assembled it on the other side, then opened the door to present it. I want to say that people don't usually smile like that. When you open your door to an unexpected knock in the Alaskan bush, your face does a series of things in rapid sequence. Surprise, assessment, recognition or non-recognition, then the appropriate social expression, which might be a smile, or it might be wariness, depending on what or who you see. This man's face skipped all that. The smile was just there, wide and warm and fixed. It stayed at the same intensity for the duration of our conversation, and it never once reached his eyes, his gray or light blue eyes, which watched me with an attention that had nothing to do with friendliness. I introduced myself. I told him my name, saying I lived a few miles south, and that I'd been tracking what I thought was a bear that had gotten into my cache. I asked if he'd seen anything. This was standard Alaskan bush conversation. You lead with the practical reason for your visit, and the personal stuff comes later or never at all. He said yes, he'd seen a bear. His voice was fine, deep, unhurried, a normal man's voice with no particular accent that I could place. He said it had been around at night, and he'd heard it outside his cabin after dark. Then he said something that I'm going to relay verbatim, because ever since I've not been able to stop thinking about it. He said, "It comes closer than you'd think, right up to your door sometimes." Then that smile widened by a quarter inch, which should not have been possible, given it was already at full extension, and I felt the skin on the back of my neck prickle, like there was a threat right in front of me. We talked for another minute or two. He stood in the doorway and I stood on the packed earth in front of the cabin, and he didn't invite me inside, but I didn't ask to come in. During those 2 minutes, I was cataloging things. Not deliberately, though. I wasn't in some investigative mindset, I was just looking around. And here's what I noticed. The guy was sweating. It was early October by this point, and the temperature was about 35 degrees, cold enough that my breath was visible, and I was wearing 2 layers under my jacket. This man was in a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, yet there were beads of sweat on his forehead, his upper lip, the hollow of his throat, where the shirt was unbuttoned. His shirt was darkened at the collar and under the arms. He was not exerting himself. He'd answered the door from a seated position. I could see a chair by the stove through the doorway, and he was standing still while he talked. He was producing the sweat of a man doing hard labor on a summer afternoon, but it was 35 degrees, and he was just standing still in the doorway. His hands were kept behind the door frame for most of the conversation, resting on the back of the door or hanging at his sides, just out of my line of sight. But he did gesture once, a quick offhand wave indicating a direction, and I saw his right hand clearly for about 2 seconds before he pulled it back. It was a large hand. That was an understatement. His hand was disproportionately large for his frame, which was already a big frame, and the fingers were thick and long. The knuckles were pronounced and darkened, with something that could have been grime or discoloration of the skin itself. The nails were either very long or very thick, maybe both. I couldn't tell because the hand was withdrawn before I got a better look, and the withdrawal was smooth and casual, and it could have easily been coincidental, but it wasn't. The door frame itself had marks on it, vertical grooves scored into the wood at roughly the height of the man's shoulder, deep enough to show raw wood underneath the weathered gray, evenly spaced lines running about 18 inches from top to bottom. They could have been made by some tool. They weren't made by a tool, though. You see, tools leave flat-bottomed grooves, and these were concave, round at the base, the shape you get when something curved and hard, like a claw, for instance, if I'm being direct with you, is dragged through wood with enough force to cut past the grain. There was a smell coming from inside the cabin that the wood smoke almost covered, but not quite. It had this warm and meaty quality to it, raw meat. I've butchered hundreds of animals, and I know what a space smells like when something has been killed and processed in it, and the inside of that cabin smelled like a killing floor. Underneath the wood smoke and meaty smell was something else. Musky, sweaty, smelled like I was downwind of a bear den in spring, but sharper, less diffuse, as though the source was nearby and concentrated. There was something on the counter inside, just barely visible past the man's left shoulder. It was dark and wet-looking, laid out on what might have been a cutting board or just the bare wood of the counter surface. It was too big to be a rabbit or a grouse, and much too dark, almost black, with a sheen to it that suggested moisture. It could have been a section of moose or caribou, but the shape was not right for any cut of game I could identify. And as I shifted my weight slightly to get a better angle, the man moved with me, keeping his shoulder between my eyes and whatever was on that counter. He did this quickly, and smoothly too, without breaking the conversation. I let him, because by that point, every part of my body was screaming at me to leave. I told him I appreciated the information about the bear. He told me to be careful out there. The smile remained. I turned and walked across the clearing toward the tree line with my rifle on my shoulder, my back to him. And God, walking away from that cabin was one of the harder things I've done in my life. It was like my every ancestor that ever existed was floating behind me, screaming to run. And the reason I didn't, I can't be certain about. It was something I can't fully explain. That running would reveal something about me, or maybe about him. For now, we were just two neighbors having a conversation. That's all, on the surface. And as long as the surface held, I was safe. But if I ran, that surface would break, and I did not want to find out what was underneath it. He watched me go. I could feel it the whole way across the clearing, and into the trees, and for a good quarter mile after that. This focused, patient attention on my back that did not go away with distance. I kept my pace steady, and I did not look back. I breathed through my nose, and I counted my steps, because that took my mind off of things. Things like that man's hands and his smile, and whatever that dark shape on the counter was. I got home, locked my door, which is something I almost never do during the day, and I sat down at my table with the rifle against the wall within arm's reach, and I ran through explanation after explanation. That man was a squatter. People build in the bush without permits sometimes. They don't tell anyone. Some of these folks have no contact at all with the outside world. Alaska has more than its share of people who have opted out of society, and not all of them are stable. Some loner living in an unregistered cabin in the backcountry is unusual, but not unheard of. His sweating could be a medical condition, anxiety. He could have been stoking the fire. And he could have just had big hands. The smell could have just been game processing. A recent moose or caribou he got. That bloody smell can linger. Taken together, all of these things fall apart. The thing that made them fall apart was everything I'd tracked over the previous 2 days. Something with retractable claws and inconsistent stride that had dissected a moose calf and arranged its organs seemingly for fun. Something that led tracks all the way to his front door. I thought about contacting someone about this. The logistics stopped me. My radio can reach the fishing lodge 30 miles south, and from there a message could get to the trooper post in town. But what was there to report so far? That my neighbor has big hands? I could hear the conversation in my head, and it sounded like every other bush hermit call-in that the troopers have to deal with. Vague, paranoid, unprovable nonsense. I had no evidence of a crime. No evidence of anything, really. So I had to do what I could. I decided to stay out of the drainage north of the creek. I would hunt south and east, in country I knew, away from the ridge and away from that cabin. The season was getting short. The first hard freeze could come any week, and once the ground locked up and the snow came, the hunting would shift to a different rhythm. I needed maybe 2 more good days to fill the cache enough to get me through, and I could do that without going anywhere near the north drainage. I know how this sounds to your listeners. I know some of you are thinking I should have left and just driven back to town with a packed bag. I considered that. Honestly, I did. But this is my home. The only place I have. The only life that works for me. Leaving it because I'm scared. Because some anomalous tracks and a neighbor who made me uncomfortable. That would mean giving up everything I've built over nearly a decade. And I was not willing to do that. Not yet. Because at the time I could still file everything under strange but survivable. I stayed then. I hunted south and east. I repaired my cache and reinforced the posts. I kept my rifle close at all times, and the door locked, and I stayed out of the north drainage. For 3 days, that arrangement was fine. But on the 4th night, it wasn't. During those 3 days, I found a boot print on the trail to my outhouse. It was in a patch of mud that I step over every time I use that trail. You see, I personally do not like muddying my boots. This wasn't my boot print. Someone or something had stepped directly in the center of it, and the print was certainly a boot, a lug-soled boot larger than mine, pressed in real deep. I wear a size 11, but this was bigger. I stood there and looked at it. Then I went to the outhouse and came back, and I looked again. After that, I went inside and locked my door. That same afternoon, I checked my cache and found a mark on one of the support posts. It was about 7 feet up, above the sheet metal. I found the same types of gouges that had been on that man's doorframe, but these were deep and fresh, cut through to the pale interior of the post. The sheet metal below the gouges was unmarked, which meant whatever had made them had reached past the metal from above, had reached up and over the barrier that was specifically designed to prevent reaching, and scored the post at a height that would require something with an arm span I did not want to think about. On the 3rd evening, just before dark, I was bringing firewood in from the pile beside the cabin, and I smelled it. That same bloody smell, carried on the breeze from the north, faint and gone almost before I caught it. I dropped the wood inside and closed my door. I locked my deadbolt, and I sat in my chair with the rifle across my lap. I stayed put until I finally fell asleep sometime after midnight. On the 4th night, I went to bed early. Darkness comes around 6 in October here. My generator fuel is not unlimited. There's only so long you can sit in a 12 by 20 cabin with a kerosene lamp with your own thoughts before the thoughts start to win. I ate, I banked the stove, and I put the lamp out. The rifle was leaning against the wall on the left side of the bed frame, where I always kept it, loaded, safety on. I was asleep by 8. I'm not sure what time it was when the door handle woke me. I didn't check. What I know is that it was fully dark, and the stove had nearly burned out, which meant at least a few hours had passed, and the sound that pulled me out of my sleep was the sound of my thumb latch on the front door being depressed, slowly. The mechanical click of the latch bar lifting out of the strike plate was distinct in that silence. A small and precise sound that I have heard 10,000 times, that my sleeping brain identified instantly as wrong. You see, I'm the only occupant, and I was in bed. So me being in bed and that latch moving were two things that could not be true at the same time, unless something was wrong. The latch made it to the top of its travel and held there. Pressure on the door. The deadbolt caught it. I could hear the door flex in its frame, not from a shove or a slam, but the steady inward pressure, someone testing the limits of what the bolt could do. That pressure held for maybe 5 seconds. Then the latch lowered, gently, and the pressure released. The door settled back into the frame, and there was silence. I was on my back in bed, my eyes open and my hands already moving toward the rifle. I got my fingers around the stock and pulled it across my body, thumbing the safety off, lying there with a steadily increasing heart rate. Then I listened. Silence. Long enough that I started to wonder if I was just dreaming. Maybe I'd dreamt the sound. Maybe I was still dreaming. But I knew deep down it was my brain offering some courtesy, better than accepting the unacceptable. After 30 seconds to a minute, something happened. The window in the main room is a double-pane unit to the right of the front door. about 2 feet by 3 feet, and I heard a sound coming from it. A creak of pressure against glass, the frame flexing as something leaned into it from outside, testing the give. Whatever was doing it was careful and methodical. The pressure increased slowly until the frame groaned. Then it stopped, and the pressure released, and there was silence again. I need you to understand what was happening here, because I think it's part of this story that I have the most difficulty with, even more than what came later. Whenever a bear wants to get into a structure, it pushes until the structure gives. It does not try the door handle, not on purpose. It doesn't test a window for flex, then back off and reconsider. What was outside my cabin that night was engaging in sequential problem solving. It tried one entry point, found it secured, and moved to the next one. And it was doing it patiently and quietly. It was not frustrated by failures. It was simply working through its options to get inside. I climbed out of bed. I didn't turn on a single light. I did not want it to know I was awake or what room I was in. In the dark, I at least had the advantage of knowing my own cabin by feel. I moved to the back corner of the main room, the corner diagonal from the front door, where I could put my back against the log wall and see the door and the window and the open doorway to the side room. The side room is where I keep my food stores, my tools, and miscellaneous equipment. It's about 8 by 10 feet, unheated, with a plywood floor that I laid over the joists when I first moved in. I stood in my corner, with the rifle up, and I waited. It circled the cabin. I tracked it by the sound of the logs creaking under pressure as something heavy leaned against the exterior wall and moved along it. It paused at the back window. There was a smaller pane of glass there, about 18 inches square, which I almost never opened. I heard that pressure on the glass again. The frame flexed, it released, and moved on. I then heard it pause at the stovepipe vent. It's a round metal collar that passes through the wall behind the stove. There was a faint metallic scraping as something touched or tested the pipe from outside. Then it moved past, and the creaking continued along the far wall, then stopped. I lost track of it, and that was disturbing. When it was moving, I could follow it, keep it located in my mental map. I would know how far it was from each potential entry point, where it currently was. But when it stopped, I had nothing to go on. It could be standing still against the wall 6 feet from me, separated by 4 inches of log, or it could have backed off into the tree line. Maybe it was doing something that I had not anticipated, and the silence offered no information. I stood in my corner with the rifle against my shoulder, and my finger along the trigger guard. I tried to control my breathing, which was fast and shallow and loud enough in the quiet cabin that I was sure whatever was outside could hear it. That quietness lasted for what I think was about 5 minutes, though time in that kind of darkness and that kind of fear loses its mechanical properties and becomes something softer, less reliable. 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 20, I don't know. What I know is that the next sound I heard did not come from outside the cabin. It came from underneath it. My cabin sits on posts. It's raised about 18 inches off the ground. Standard construction for permafrost country, where you don't want the heat from your floor melting the ground beneath the building and destabilizing the foundation. The gap between the ground and the floor joists is skirted with sheets of plywood that I nailed up in my first year to keep animals from dinning under the structure. The plywood was old, though, and I had not yet replaced it, and I knew, even as I heard the first crack, that it was not going to hold anything that wanted through it. The sound was a splintering, flexing crack from the south side of the cabin, a sheet of plywood being pushed inward by something that was pressing against it from outside. and then the looser sound of the board giving way and falling flat. Then something was under my cabin, under my floor, and I could hear it moving beneath me. Something heavy. The scrape and drag of a large body pulling itself through an 18-inch gap between frozen ground and floor joists. The joists above it creaked as its back or shoulders pressed up against the underside of my floor, and the sound traveled from the south wall toward the north wall, toward the side room, and I stood in the main room, tracking it with my rifle barrel pointed at the floor, as though I could shoot through it, which I probably could, but I wouldn't. A 30-06 round through my own floor into a dark crawl space at an unknown target was not a shot I was going to take. It reached the side room. I heard it directly under the plywood floor in there, and I heard the boards react. The loose ones. The ones I'd been meaning to fix in spring, because the moisture had warped them and they didn't sit flush anymore. A board lifted. I heard the wooden clap of it tilting on the joist and dropping back, then another, further into the room, then a third, and this one didn't drop back. It was pushed up and aside with a scraping sound. Cold air came through the gap, and that musky smell came with it. Thick and immediate, so strong it was almost a physical presence. That same animal and bloody stench from the man's cabin, but concentrated now, enclosed, filling the small space of my home. Something came up through the floor of the side room. I could hear it. The creak of the joists taking weight in a way they weren't designed to take. The scrape of the plywood boards being displaced. The heavy, effortful sound of a large body hauling itself through an opening that was barely big enough to accommodate it. And now, it was inside. I could hear it breathing in the side room, about 12 feet away from me through an open doorway in the dark. And the breathing was so deep and low, a sort of bellows sound that was too loud and too slow to be human, with a rasp on each exhale that made my chest hurt. It moved. Things fell off shelves. Cans, I think, from the sound, and something heavier that hit the plywood with a thud. It was navigating the room with a strange combination of power and caution, bumping against things then adjusting, and I could hear its feet on the plywood. They did not sound like paws or boots, but something with a heavy tread and a clicking undertone that could have been claws on wood, or maybe something else, but I didn't have a comparison for that. A glass jar then fell and broke, and the thing paused at the sound, and its breathing changed, becoming faster, shorter. Then it made a sound that I'm going to do my best to describe, even though I know I will fail. It came from low in the chest or the throat, a huffing sound, almost a cough. But underneath it, there was something tonal, something that rose and fell in a way that was closer to a voice than an animal sound, like a man trying to speak through a mouth that was not shaped for speech, or some intelligent animal actually trying to mimic the sound of a human. It wasn't a growl, and it wasn't a word, but something else entirely. Then, the shape filled the doorway. I saw it in silhouette, in the marginally less dark rectangle of the side room. And when I say marginally, I mean the difference between absolute black and something one shade above it. The side room has no window. What little I could see was defined by the faintest ambient glow from the coals in the stove reflecting off surfaces in the main room, and it was enough to give me an outline. And an outline was far too much for my brain. The thing was bent, compressed into a shape that fit under the 7-foot ceiling, but that clearly did not belong under a 7-foot ceiling. The mass of it was enormous, filling the doorframe side to side, and the posture was hunched, folded, a body that was too big for the space, and it was making continuous structural compromises to fit inside. The head was forward, extended on a neck that angled out from the shoulders at something close to 45 degrees, and the head itself was all screwed up, and thankfully the darkness then prevented me from fully appreciating what was there. I could tell, though, it had a long and heavy jaw, with a brow ridge that I could see as a horizontal shadow above the eyeline. The shoulders behind the head were the widest part, absurdly broad. And from the shoulders, the arms, or maybe the front legs, hung down well past the midpoint of the body, long enough that if it had straightened them, they would have reached the floor, even while it stood semi-upright. And the hands at the end of those arms were similar to the hands I'd seen in the doorway of the man's cabin, except they were even larger now. Or maybe I was just closer. And the fingers were curled inward, showing me exactly how long the nails were. But they were not nails. These were claws. It stood in the doorway, and I stood in my corner. We were 12 feet apart in the dark. I could hear that breathing and smell that bloody smell throughout my cabin like some sort of horrific gas leak. It knew I was there. I knew it did, since the first sound at the door handle. But I understood that with full clarity now, standing in that corner with my back to the wall and the rifle up. It had tested the door because it knew I was behind it. It had tested the windows because it was looking for a way to reach me. It went under the cabin, coming through the floor, and here it was now in my home in the dark, looking right at me. It took a step into the main room. The floor groaned and I felt the vibration through my boots. Its breathing shifted faster, making that noise again, and underneath it was a different sound, the rapid clicking from its mouth or jaw, almost insect-like, as if the teeth were working against each other, or the jaw hinge was opening and closing in quick succession. The sound was eager, and that made my blood freeze. My vision narrowed, and my hands went steady somehow. I think it was adrenaline, calming my nerves as I aimed the rifle towards it. I was going to fire. There was nothing else to do. If I didn't fire now, I would simply be killed, and I would not be here to tell this story. The last thing I wanted was to be in reach of those hand-like claws. I fired. A 30-06 in an enclosed log cabin is not a sound. It's more of a concussive event. The muzzle flash blew the darkness apart for a fraction of a second. A white-yellow blast of light lit the entire room in a single freeze frame. In that frame, and in that moment, we saw each other. And that image was burned into my head permanently. I cannot describe the rest of it. What I've already given you was the limits of my description. Everything else in my mind will stay with me, because I have no other choice. The dark came back in an instant. That thing screamed, and it was so human. A scream, full-throated and agonizing. There was surprise in it, a raw sound, so close to the sound of a grown man in pain, that my first instinct in the ringing aftermath of the gunshot was not relief, but guilt. I felt guilty for defending myself, as though I'd made a terrible mistake, like I'd shot a neighbor. It went through the wall, not the door or the window, the wall beside the doorway to the side room. An explosion of splintered log and insulation and cold air flooded in, and I heard it land on the frozen ground outside, and it moved, crashing through thick woods, heading north, heading toward the creek and the ridge, and probably that man's cabin. It took about 15 seconds before the sound of it moving faded to nothing. There was still a ringing in my ears, and a terrible cold pouring in through that hole in my wall. And that smell, it remained, now mixed with gunpowder. The silence of the woods at night after something so loud had happened, it was so bizarre, but relieving. Suddenly, my legs buckled underneath me, and I fell down. I was suddenly on the floor with my back against the wall and my rifle across my knees. My hands, which were calm only seconds ago, were now shaking so hard I couldn't make them stop. I sat there until the sky started to lighten through the hole in my wall. It must have been about 5 hours. That whole 5 hours I did not move. and I did not sleep. I listened to the silence with an intensity that I think cost me something that I have yet to get back. At dawn, I got up. I walked to the side room and I looked at the floor. 2 boards were displaced, pushed up from below and shoved aside. The gap between them was maybe 2 feet wide and 18 inches across, barely enough for a man to fit through, and yet that thing had done it. There was blood on the edges of the boards, blood on the floor of the side room and on the wall where it went through. Dark and thick, darker than a man's blood. And the trail continued outside, through the shattered section of wall, across the yard and into the trees. I followed it for about 100 yards. I needed to know. The trail started at the cabin wall with boot prints, human boot prints in the churned up mud and frost. A lug-soled boot larger than mine, pressing deep under a weight that was running. Over the next 30 yards, the prints changed. The stride went longer, and the shape narrowed, lengthening, the toe impressions deepening and spreading as the heel receded. And by the time the blood trail thinned and disappeared into the brush, the prints on the ground were no longer boots, and they were not human feet. There was something in between everything I'd seen so far, and they led north toward the creek. I did not follow them further. I patched the wall with plywood and 2x4s. I screwed the crawl space skirting down with structural screws instead of nails, and I added a second layer. I reset the floorboards in the side room, bolting a sheet of plywood over them. I drove to town on a road that was already half frozen, buying ammunition and plywood, and I didn't tell a soul about what happened. I bought a new deadbolt and a padlock for the crawl space access, and 80 rounds of 30-06. I drove home and installed everything. And I'm still here. I went back to the man's clearing 6 weeks after that, after the first real freeze. I took my rifle and I crossed the creek. I walked to the exact spot where the cabin had stood. There was nothing there. No foundations or log ends, no ash from a stove, no depression in the ground where a structure had sat. Only spruce and moss and quiet. If I hadn't stood in front of that cabin, knocking on the door and looking at the man's smile, smelling blood on the air, I would have said nothing, and no one had ever been there. What a disturbing story. All the more reason to stay far away from Alaska. Let the modern pioneers handle it. What do you think it was, though? A desperate bear? Or something like a bear man? Even a werewolf? Let me know. Good night. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Tales from the Break Room. If you're not listening on the podcast side, you're actually not getting a bonus story that I've narrated. So if you're on YouTube, head over to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Search for and follow Tales from the Break Room, and you'll be getting a bonus story for this episode. Till next time, everyone, I'll be clocking out. Don't worry, I'll be back again real soon.